We've got 7 of the most popular dual cab utes in Australia, including 2 that we've never tested before. That just walked up. Right now, we're proper stuck into the ultimate challenge, taking them from the bush to the beach to find out which one's the best.
Slow, steady.
Doesn't like that step up.
We're not holding back in testing them the way you want them to be tested.
It's clunky, it's shuddery, it's not in the same league as any of the other cars.
What?
Wow. That's impressive.
Wow. It's exceeding expectations. I can't believe that I'm actually going to say this, but if I was going to buy one brand new, it would be this is Ute of the Year. We've got an absolute cracker of a lineup this year. Let's start with the newcomers. First up, the all-new Volkswagen Amarok Style, which is a whole different vehicle compared to ones we've tested previously. Although this vehicle is new, being released in early 2022, unlike its predecessor, this vehicle features a true low-range transfer case, which is perfect for those who want to go out and adventure just a little bit more. Which brings me on to our next contender, the Ford Ranger Wildtrak X. Ford describes this car as one that bridges the gap between the high-performance Ranger Raptor and the recreational-orientated Wildtrak. However, the Wildtrak X only comes with the 2-litre 4-cylinder bi-turbo. Let's see if it can stand its ground against the Amarok. The GWM Cannon XSR is a new face to the 4Drive 24/7 channel. For some of you that may not know this vehicle, GWM introduced their off-road orientated vehicle, the Cannon XSR, in early 2022 to the Australian market. Next on our list, the Nissan Navara Pro 4X Warrior. There's no denying that the Navara is a good-looking ute. With that front-end upgraded bumper, more aggressive tyres, and even rear coil-sprung suspension with upgraded suspension in the Warrior, this vehicle looks the part. The Isuzu D-Max X-Terrain and the Mazda BT50 GT 4x4 Thunder will be 2 vehicles that will be compared to each other quite frequently on our tests. They share the same 3-litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel engine. The only noticeable difference you'll see are mainly cosmetic design. It's going to be interesting to see if we can find any difference in the models compared to the rest of the lineup. And of course, we have the trusty Toyota Hilux Rogue. Toyota has been a staple in the Australian market for several years, with consumers using them for work throughout the week and then tackling tough tracks on the weekend. This model of Hilux is a little bit long in the tooth now, with the original variants of this style model coming out in 2015. So the question remains, will it be able to stand up to the current new generation of utes that it's going to be put against, or will it fall behind? With all that being said, we need a crew to test drive these vehicles. So I've enlisted the help of a couple of mates of mine who are also experts in the 4-drive industry. First up, we have Tommy and Liv from Performance Tourers, who specialise in diesel performance. Next, we have our off-road recovery expert, Chris from Tread. Chris has seen a fair amount of crazy recoveries whilst out 4-driving in his time, and he knows what will get a 4-drive stuck. A vehicle test wouldn't be complete without a brake torture test. So we have Ian from Bendix helping us out. Ian's been on a few of our Ute of the Year tests, and if there's one thing he knows, it's brake upgrades and how to get the most out of your standard brakes. As soon as Stephen from Pinnacle 4x4 heard we were doing another Ute of the Year, he knew he had to be involved again. Steve is our expert mechanic on this test, and he gets thousands of these utes through his workshop each year. Aaron from Mitts Alloy is no stranger to the channel. As most of you know, Aaron is a seasoned 4-wheel driver and has wheeled a bunch of different utes in his time. Aaron's our canopy expert on this test. And if you couldn't guess by now, I'll also be driving these vehicles and sharing my opinions on which one is best suited for your needs. We've chosen the diesel automatic version of each one so the test is even. We don't get a huge choice of models, so you'll see a lot of them are the top spec with fancy trimming. We will factor this into all of our testing. You might be looking at these utes thinking you're missing a few, and you'd be dead right. Of course, we are missing a Mitsubishi Triton, and that's because next year Mitsubishi are releasing a brand new model, as well as a new Navara. But considering we've never had the NP300 on a test before, it seems only fair that we see how it stacks up against the current models of utes on the market before we move on to the new model. Another one that's also missing is, of course, the V8 79, but to be honest, that vehicle is probably in the next level up. Next year though, with the 4-cylinder Auto 79 coming out, maybe we'll have to put it head-to-head to these utes to see how it stacks up. Righto, enough talking from me, let's get into the testing. For each of the vehicles we have today, we have 10 sections that we'll be scoring them out of. Each will be scored out of 10 from each of our drivers to find the average score for each section. From that, we'll be able to find our pick for Ute of the Year. Most auto journos take their vehicles on some pretty mediocre tracks. But we're here to test these vehicles, so let's test them the right way. We're pointing our noses up a couple of tracks here in the Glasshouse Mountains, which is known to have some of the toughest wheeling in Australia. One thing to remember is not all of these utes come with upgraded tyres in their off-road packages. So some of these contenders are at a bit of a disadvantage with traction, but the same could be said with suspension. So you'll have to factor that in when you consider one of these utes.
All right, straight off the road, there's a little rutted section, climbs up the hill. I'm in the Ranger, and this is going to be a good test straight up. I've never driven one of these off-road, so I'm keen to see how it goes.
We're going to be looking at a few things during this off-road test. How well the traction control system works, so we will attempt challenges without putting the lockers on first. Then we will see how easy it is to engage the locker and get up the challenges. We'll also be looking at approach and departure angles, gearing in low range, and suspension articulation.
Now obviously that's the time where you can keep pushing through, but in this case I reckon I'll chuck the rear locker in, look after the vehicle and the track, and just happy days. That rear locker made all the difference up there, super easy to turn on. It's good that these utes come in factory with that stuff now. Means that you don't risk damaging the vehicle as much, you can go nice and smooth and controlled. Works out nicely. Pop that rear locker on and we'll give it another shot. And of course, drives it with ease, really just makes the world of difference.
Not bad. He put the rear locker in for that, but you could hear as he lifted the wheel, definitely scraped the rear tow bar. So maybe not as great a departure angle as the Ranger, but did all right.
Look at that, just bite. Don't like that. Come on, just bite that.
Yeah. Wow, that's actually really impressive.
Very, very well played, Nissan.
Nice. Well, that was with the rear locker off, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely flex more on the rear straight away.
So,
yeah, and the traction control worked well. I mean, we've all tried to take the same line through the guts there.
yeah.
I'm actually thoroughly impressed by that.
Good front traction, pulling it up.
Yeah.
So a couple of the vehicles that have gone up before me ended up having to use that factory rear locker. So let's see how we go.
Yeah, that traction control's working.
That's one thing Toyota have done really well.
Well, colour me impressed. That did it relatively easy. We got a little bit stuck there in some of the spots, but after giving it a little bit more gentle, as Jock would say, she crawled up. No rear locker needed. That was pretty bloody impressive.
Just like the BT50, the low range on this isn't low enough, and you really have to ride the brakes.
Look, don't get me wrong, it's going everywhere, but it's clunky, it's shuddery, it's scraping on every single thing around us.
Now, all these utes have rear lockers, which make them really capable on this kind of terrain. However, one of them is twin locked, and it might not be the one you're thinking.
Beautiful.
Yep, that's right. The Cannon top spec model comes twin locked from factory. Let's test it out.
That is easy.
Graceful, thy name is Cannon.
Let's get him to put the front locker on.
You got both lockers on? That's the rear window. You got both lockers
I've
on?
done that twice now. Yeah, both lockers are on.
That just walked up.
Mate, I am honestly
Is that twin locked?
blown away. That's both lockers on, point and shoot. I did not move my foot the whole time, just a slight acceleration.
Yeah, wow.
That's impressive.
Wow. Yeah. Not bad. The car you want to hate.
Oh man.
Yeah, the Cannon's been the underdog of this trip so far, and all of us weren't quite sure what to expect, but it's exceeding expectations.
Yeah, that was impressive.
That's done it the best out of every ute here, and some that are worth tens of thousands of dollars more.
Yeah.
Just slipping a little bit, but so far so good.
I mean, I guess it does give you a bull bar and some bash plates and stuff from factory, so...
Don't know if she likes it there. All right, rear locker is on. Nice and easily give this another crack.
That's it.
Oh.
Get back a bit.
That's a pop tyre.
Doesn't like that step up.
Yep, stop there. Come forward. And come to me with a little bit of momentum as you go up. Yep.
Hey.
Nice.
Well done, Liv. Nice.
Yeah, that's got Jocko's name all over it.
Yep.
Thanks, mate. Don't actually like that too much.
Well, the BT50 struggled a little bit getting up there, but again, having that rear locker in just made it work nicely. Next up, though, is the big dog Amarok, the luxury mobile.
Hey, skins, bro.
Yes, power through. Yep.
Yeah.
Nice, mate. Well done. I mean, our highway terrains, the Ranger walked up and it's got similar setup.
Yeah.
So a good set of tyres on that, I reckon you'd be golden. The huge surprise winner here has to be the Cannon. Being twin locked makes it more capable than all the other utes, so it gets top marks. The Navara gained a point with that coil rear. We did see it flex more, and upgraded suspension will take that to another level. The Hilux has supreme traction control. Toyota have always nailed this technology, so they gain a point here. We've headed up north to a nearby coastline to test the performance of these utes in the soft sand of Tiwa Beach. Let's see how they handle it.
This Amarok is a thing of beauty on the beach. It's got plenty of power when you put your foot down if you get into some softer sand, but it's also nice and smooth, easy to drive. And we've come up to a couple of bit more washed out sections, and I've managed the speed to see how the suspension will react. It's nice and smooth through the bumps as well, so it's definitely one to drive nice and easy on the beach. I guess the same could be said for the V6 Ranger as well.
A simple yet impressive feature on this VW Amarok is a digital display of automatic transmission temperature on the dash, which can be absolutely imperative when it comes to heavy towing as well as driving along the beach. Something else that I think the existing Amarok owners will find really appealing about the new V6 is the fact that they have now included a 4-low from standard, so that is going to be one of the biggest improvements, in my opinion, that they could have made over the previous model.
V6 Volkswagen Amarok, I mean, we all know this is built on the Ford Ranger platform. What this lacks in, tyres we're on basically highway tyres. What it lacks in tyres and ground clearance, it makes up for in grunt. So one would assume that this thing is going to be an absolute animal out here on the beach. It should be able to power through.
You know, I actually think Volkswagen really hit it out of the park with this vehicle. Just everything about it feels good, feels right. Now, we expected the driveline and everything to be as, equal to the Ford Ranger, which we've had for some time to be able to test with. And of course, we know that it makes great power and gearbox feels great. Everything feels fantastic. But I just think that Volkswagen have really got the interior and exterior of this vehicle very, very right. It's styled well, it's classy, it's everything that you would expect a Volkswagen to be.
There we go, 2-litre Ranger in the soft sand. Plenty of torque, got to work it up the rev range a little bit more. Doesn't quite go like the V6, but not too bad. But yeah, the suspension is much stiffer over the rest of the competition in the Convoy.
Not bad, still does not have the guts where you would really want it. Really seems to be downshifting to try and keep those revs up and try and deliver that power.
You can definitely feel like the tracks on this car are a lot wider. It just feels more boxy and bigger in general compared to the little D-Max. So apparently the old Ranger doesn't like sitting still for too long, because if you do, it likes to turn itself off and turn itself back on again, which there is a button to stop that, I've now discovered. But it also chucked it back into 2-wheel drive, which resulted in me getting bogged. And now first round of beers are on me at the pub tonight, so how good's that? It's one in every group.
Going from the Amarok straight into the GWM, this thing definitely doesn't have the power that the Amarok does, but it's keeping up. It's a fraction of the cost of the others. This is the top of the line one, and it's still the cheapest one we've got in the test. So value for money so far. I mean, I've only just started driving it, but I'm really keen to see how it goes.
Yeah, Not super responsive when I put my foot down. A bit laggy. Definitely doesn't know what gear it wants to be in. I reckon it'd be a perfect little runabout car, you know, especially if you're first getting into it, getting into the whole camping, you know, going off-road kind of thing. I think it'd be a great first car, you know.
Currently driving the Navara on the beach, and on the way up to the beach from Brizzy, I noticed when I put my foot down with this vehicle, it was a little bit underwhelming. Didn't feel like it had heaps of power, but since being on the beach, chucking into four-wheel drive, it's fine. It's fine in the sand. It's got plenty of torque to get up and go, and the fact it's not a unique feature by any means, having that manual mode just to select the gears makes it much nicer for driving on the sand.
It's very smooth. You notice the coil rear in the back of it. Even the front stocky suspension in the front's just nice and smooth. Just absolutely soaks up all the bumps. The only thing I would say is that it's just lacking a bit of throttle response, but it's to be expected with a common rail diesel. Guess an Ultimate 9 would be pretty handy in most of these vehicles on the beach, I reckon.
No major changes in the Nissan department this year. These engines have proven to be quite powerful and have a really good support in the aftermarket. Very capable little engines and cars, and can quite easily increase power and torque by over 30% by just ECU remapping only.
In the D-Max now, and it's definitely the twin to the BT50. I also find that this is actually a little bit nicer to drive than the BT50. I think that the bull bar on the BT50 really weighs the front end of it down. It just doesn't drive as nicely as this does. So the BT50 could definitely use, if you're going to get a Thunder Pack, a suspension upgrade in it straight away, whereas this, straight out of the gate, you could definitely bring it down for a day at the beach without doing that.
It's interesting because sharing the same powertrain as the D-Max, for a fair bit less you could get one of them. And obviously if you downspec the BT50, you'd be similarly priced as well. But I mean, I'm no stranger to using this engine and transmission in the bush. They're proven, they're reliable, and they work. And on the beach I should say, it's nice and comfy and easy to drive, nice and smooth.
But there's something about it that just makes it feel honest. It just feels like a good, honest, reliable car. Something that you can buy and know that you're going to be able to kit it out, go touring, go four-wheel driving, go to places like this, and rely on the vehicle starting every morning.
So just finishing up some beach driving now in the Hilux Rogue. I've got to say it's pretty impressive in comparison to my SR Hilux. You can definitely notice the difference in stability with that wider wheel track, and I think it's one of the biggest advantages that the Rogue has over the likes of the SR or the SR5. I do find it a little bit poor that they didn't go to the length of putting longer struts and doing a proper suspension kit in these. Rather, they've gone with the likes of a strut spacer in the front. I think it's realistically not great value for money. It seems to ride okay, but in comparison to the Ford Ranger, which comes with a small lift and off-road tyres, it's really not cutting the mustard.
The standout was clearly the Amarok. With all that power on tap, it gets top marks. The Ranger also has the auto temps visible on the infotainment system, which we really like. However, the 10-speed does hunt through gears pretty hard in the soft sand, and the start-stop function, putting it back to two-wheel drive, levels out the plus sides. The rest all got a pass mark, other than the Cannon, which we found to be a touch sluggish and lacking a bit of get up and go compared to the other utes. Our aim going into this tow test is to see which vehicles perform the best with a stock 2.8 tonne van. It's also worth noting that we're not looking at how much each can tow, but how well it will be able to tow a caravan, big boat, or a tool trailer during the week. With our Jawa caravans getting ready to saddle up, the tow ball weight sitting on each vehicle is around 160 kilograms. This wasn't a struggle for most in the lineup, but the BT50 seemed to be the only one showing the effects of the weight, with those rear leaf springs struggling to carry the load. We found the BT and D-Max had plenty of grunt to drag the Jawa around, however the transmission hunted a lot between gears.
I will say this, it's actually doing okay in drive. Just through these undulations, it is hunting some gears though.
Feels like it travels a lot happier too when you're sitting around that 90k mark.
Yeah.
As soon as you start to roll up towards that 100k's, you feel like you get swayed on a little bit. The car doesn't really know where it wants to sit.
This car definitely knows that the Sirocco's on the back there. I feel like the front end is a bit loose. It is loose, yeah. That's what I feel.
The Navara surprised us and towed the van better than we might have expected. However, the gear shifting was rough and the coil suspension meant that the van wasn't as stable behind it compared to the others.
There's a big hole between second and third.
Yeah.
Don't notice it when it's empty, but
Just hold the gears. What's that?
4,000? 4.5?
$4,500 before it changes. So it knows there's some weight on it.
See, we're down to the floor. That's just holding it to the carpet.
Yep. I was honestly expecting it to sag way more in the bum than it did.
Absolutely. No, it copes with it well. And if you're going 2 hours down the road from home once a month or whatever, it does it. It's pulling the...
It's moving around a bit, isn't it? Yeah. I think this and the Cannon have been the vehicles so far that have surprised me the most.
Yeah.
While the Cannon had been impressing us with every test so far, we saw a big difference between it and the others when towing.
It doesn't take much for it to want to kick back down a couple of gears. The nose of this feels like it wants to wander and dance on the road a little bit.
This motor in this thing just does not have the power to be a workhorse, not hauling anything. Couple that with the wailing suspension bouncing all over the place and the driveline vibration. This, unfortunately, this car that has been just surprising us, put it in this task, it's not in the same league as any of the other cars.
One thing we loved about towing with the Hilux was that rear sway bar and the upgraded suspension. It definitely helped when cornering with the van on the back.
Coming down this range with the van on the back, pretty impressed with the stability and the way that it handles. It feels relatively stable. The nice wide wheel track is obviously a big advantage of this Rogue over essentially the SR, for example. But it definitely is a little bit bouncy in the rear end.
The Amarok with that big V6 should be a standout, and it was. The torque of that engine matched really well with the transmission, and the added tech made all the difference.
This car it's beautiful to drive.
It almost feels like you're in a sports car.
Yeah, it really does. That's a good way of putting it.
Personally, I would still own the Hilux and D-Max over this car, but the way that this drives in comparison is chalk and cheese.
Yeah, big time. Amarok and Ranger are starting to, obviously they're in the next generation of utes now, but they've really raised the bar in what's expected from these vehicles these days.
So we're about to go back down the mountain range now, and you can see 97 degrees is the hottest the transmission temperature has got.
I still think that the fact that you can even see what the temp's doing is fantastic.
Yeah.
The Ranger shared all the same tech as the Amarok, which was excellent. However, that 2-litre did have to work so much harder while towing.
So I've hooked up the trailer, and if we go, there we go, trailer. And with all this fancy system in here, we can add a new trailer, confirm. So now that we've got all that trailer set up, all our cross-traffic alert system and everything will adjust, and we should be good to go for towing.
It's a bit gutless, isn't it? When you're really, under the pump, that'd be very underwhelming. Doesn't seem to be hunting up and down through the gears too much. The suspension is almost too firm. Yeah. Given we have weight on it, all in all, this thing's running at 12.8 litres per 100 on this trip so far.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Did I notice then, when we were coming down the hill, engine braking?
I was thinking the same thing.
That's excellent.
It just held it. I didn't have to brake on.
Yeah.
It just stuck in that gear and just held it downhill.
Not even in cruise control or anything.
The Amarok was a clear standout in our tests, with that thumping V6 engine pulling the vans like they weren't even there. Although you did feel the 2.8 tonnes behind the Wildtrak, it most definitely felt stable and it got the job done. In the middle of the pack was the Hilux with a 7. If this was a vehicle you'd want to use for full-time towing, you may want to tune the engine and upgrade the suspension. The Navara and D-Max coming in next with a score of 6, as they're nowhere near being the leaders in the towing industry, they still drove fairly well, with the Navara needing a valve body upgrade to help with longer gear shifting, and the D-Max in some need of a suspension upgrade. Unfortunately, with those driveline vibrations and the factory spring rate, the Cannon drops the ball, scoring a 4. Before we got the vehicles muddy, we sent them over to EFS to get checked out. It's one of the most important components of a dual cab ute, and every manufacturer does their suspension setup slightly differently. To do this section justice, I'm going to throw to Jesse, who's going to get these up on a hoist to properly show you the difference in these utes.
Thanks, Jock. I'm here in sunny Brisbane today down at EFS. These guys are full drive suspension experts. They've been making suspension since the 60s, and Colin, well, he's forgotten more about dual cab suspension than we actually know. So we're going to throw him off the hoist and Colin's going to tell us the goods and the bads of each model. Colin has been in the suspension game for close to 50 years and has been with EFS for over 20 years in their research and development team.
We've got the GWM Cannon up here on the hoist, and we're going to have a look at the front suspension on this to start with. This is basically a Toyota front end, e.g. Hilux, Prado. If you even look back here, you'll see the bump stop looks exactly the same. You lift them 50 mil quite easily, but you've got to be mindful of your rack ends and your CV shaft angle, just to keep all that so it doesn't lock up, bind up and give you some issues. There's also a bit of a misconception out there that there are not a lot of aftermarket parts available for these Chinese-built vehicles, which is not true. There is lots out there. Do your research, you'll find it. And as you can see, the second stage is already impacting in, and you can see witness marks of the bump stop actually hitting here. This is on a clean skin car, and that toe ball's pretty clear, so it hasn't had a trailer or anything on it yet. That could do to be replaced straight away. Now over here on the bench is an aftermarket replacement. As you can see here, the primary is nice cambered, and that'll ride nice and smooth with no load on it. Then you've got our second stage section here that's reverse cambered, and as the load increases, it'll impact into the second stage here, or make contact, and then that will carry the weight. Up here next, Wildtrak X. Beautiful car. Now this has got a big cast aluminium upright, so it's fairly solid and chunky. This vehicle is already fitted with approximately a 50 mil lift. So there's really not a lot that you could do with this to lift at any torque. What you could do is if you were to put a bull bar and a winch or something on that, you could upgrade this spring to a heavier spring to keep that 50 mil lift that you've got. So there's still options available for this, even though it does have a factory fitted upgraded suspension. The upgraded rear suspension, it's got another 2 leaves in it over the standard one. It looks like it's got a bit more camber in it too, reverse camber in that second stage. With these spring overs, because that means it sits on top of the diff, as soon as you add a leaf, like just for example, these are about 7 or 8 mil thick, that will actually lift the car that 8 mil. Now, when you lift these cars, a lot of the times you'll get a driveline vibration. Sometimes you can put spacers in to bring this down. So it's all about keeping your output shaft CV in line with your input shaft there. Now, this is the first car that I've seen that's got that style of input on the diff. This shouldn't have any problems, but if it does, you can just space it down at the top there, just bring that center bearing down. Now, the Nissan Pro 4X Warrior, like the Wildtrak X, comes with factory fit upgraded suspension package. Now, this is around 40 millimeter lift, and as you can see here, this upper arm's almost coming in contact with the spring tower. So you wouldn't want to lift this car any more than it is, unless you were to lengthen the shock absorber, and that'd be total madness. This is the only coil sprung one in the whole range of the dual cab. Coil springs are great for off-road. They've gone for a variable rate coil, so it can, as the load goes on, it becomes stronger for towing. Not renowned for carrying a great load, these things, but they are comfortable. More wear points in a 5-link rear end like this. 10 bushes to keep an eye on. So on a coil sprung rear end, there's a lot of components to keep up. It's a lot of maintenance to look after. One thing they do is they do handle torque a lot better. You know, they don't try to roll the diff out like a leaf spring vehicle does. You know, all the torque they make nowadays, that diff tries to roll. The reason why coil springs aren't as good for towing is because of that lack of lateral support. I mean, it's just a little spring standing up on its own that can do this. So as that gets the wobble up and then you get down the end of your A-frame to your caravan to the back of your caravan, that whip can actually get quite substantial. Right, here we have Mazda BT50, and on the hoist is the Isuzu D-Max. Now, these cars are built on the same platform. Couple of trim changes, but underneath these cars are identical. Right, here we are under the front of the D-Max. One problem these things suffer from terribly is bump steer. What's bump steer? Well, bump steer is the suspension compresses and extends. These rack ends here come in and out like that, which then move the wheel. And that's doing this. Now, what happens then is you get wear on the inside edge of your tyres. So it's bump steering. Now, there are solutions out there to fix this bump steer issue, but they're quite expensive. That's if you want to go that way, or you can just rotate your tyres on a regular basis. If you've got an Isuzu D-Max, the first thing I would do would be to change the shock absorbers out to a better quality shock absorber. These are just the bicycle pump. But then as you start adding your accessories, your canopy and towing more, you'd want to upgrade the springs so you get more height and better carrying capacity. As you can see, this car's at standard height. It's got a nice shackle angle already. Now, if you were to lift this 50 mil straight up like that, this shackle would be straight up and down. So then the right compromise. Usually the eye's up top here, but we've put that underneath. That drops the shackle down, enables us to put more camber into the primary to increase this gap in here. The greater gap in between here gives you a smoother ride. We've got the Isuzu and the BT50. Now, they're both on exactly the same platforms as we spoke of earlier. Now, the one difference between these two cars at the moment is this has a steel bull bar fitted to it and this one doesn't. And as you can see, the front's down a little bit. Now, that's not a really heavy bar, but that front's down. So if you were to accessorize your car with a bigger bar and a winch and stuff, that nose will drop even more. So once again, highlighting the need to upgrade the front suspension if you go for either one of these cars. Next up here, we've got the Toyota Hilux Rogue. Now, Toyota have done a little trick here. They've widened the track. Now, how they've done that is they've put a spacer at the top of the strut here and it's angled it out. Now, they've put a longer lower arm and a different top arm in. This upright's still the same, but it's got a different sway bar. Let's push this all out. If you can see here, there's a different pickup point and it's at the front here, whereas on the Hilux, the normal Hilux, it's here on the arm. So to get all this out, they've had to angle. There's something else that we're seeing more and more of on these newer cars is these little shields to protect these components like the boot and the CV shaft here. Now we're at the back of the Rogue. Uses an outboard mounted shock absorber with a pin at the top instead of an eye. So the reason for that is there's no room under there to put a big shock absorber like this, so it's got the pickup point on the bottom. So they've put the bracket on the outside of the diff. Once again, very clever thinking. Now let's have a look what's different. We've got a sway bar, which is very unusual for a leaf spring from a factory point of view. You can buy them aftermarket, so that's a nice little addition. Nice solid leaf spring. Now this is not impacting too hard onto the second stage, so the ride would be okay. Now that's a fairly big shock absorber too for a leaf sprung car, which is what we would run. This shackle, this has got me beat. I don't know why it would be that long. Is it for like to dampen some oscillations in the suspension or something? It could very well be. Well, here we are under the front of the Volkswagen Amarok, and as you can see, it's exactly the same as the Ford Ranger we looked at earlier. So if you ever accessorize, like you had a bar and a winch and all that, and you want to bring the height up, well, you'll have to change your coil springs out. If you want a bit more ground clearance, give the vehicle some better off-road ability. Once again, upgrade the coil springs and the shock absorbers. We looked at that Wildtrak X earlier. Here's what a standard Ranger spring looks like, 3+1. They use a conical type bump stop that's very progressive in its rate. That's one of the differences between the Volkswagen and the Ford on their leaf sprung rear suspension. Under this Amarok, you can see it's got the spring with the shackle pointing down. The previous model Amarok, well, it had an outboard suspension system that the shackle could go inverted. It was up the other way. That's just how they did it. But now they're sharing a platform with Ford. It's underneath. Now, all vehicles we've had on the hoist here today, EFS has a full range of suspension and heaps of accessories for each and every model that we've done today. The standard suspension on these things is fine if you're just doing your daily run around to the supermarket or whatever. But the moment you start going off-road and jumping this thing and cruising through the beach and doing all that stuff, that is when you need to upgrade your suspension. If I could, and I had the money to buy one, would be this Volkswagen Amarok.
The standouts with suspension would have to be the Ranger and the Amarok. While the Wildtrak X comes with upgraded suspension from factory, their base suspension setup is well thought out and easily modifiable for you to get a good lift and a good load carrying ability. The Navara's coil suspension will definitely articulate better off-road if set up correctly. But we have to remember coil setups mean more maintenance costs and need a lot more work to get them towing as well as leaf rears. The updated suspension setup in the Hilux Rogue has excellent additions with bigger shocks and that rear sway bar which will help with towing. But we don't like the strut spacers. They aren't the most bushproof component to add to suspension. The D-Max and BT50 standard suspension has its flaws and the bump steer issue means you need to rotate your tyres really regularly. The plus side is they're really easy to modify and you can get a decent lift out of them. The Cannon is much better put together than some might expect. However, the fact that standard leads are already working that hard without any load means they need to be replaced very quickly. They drop a point for this.
There you go, Jocko. That's some information you're not going to get from any other dual cab ute test. Now, which one would I choose? I'm going to have to wait to the end of the test, obviously, but don't be surprised if it starts with N and ends with Isen.
When it comes to the term bushproof, what do we actually mean? When you find yourself out and about in remote areas, whether it's Cape York, the Simpson Desert, or the Kimberley, what parts are you going to take with you and how easy is it to change out for those inevitable breakdowns here and there? And that can range from changing out things like drive shafts and serpentine belts through to heater hoses and especially alternators and starter motors.
You can see here this Ford Ranger incorporates these silly push lock fittings for the boost hoses, something that you're not likely to find at Bamaga service station if you do have a belt failure or a stick works its way into this hose. Other thing definitely worth mentioning is the location of the intercooler, quite low down here just in behind the bumper. If you were to hit a stick or something along those lines, it's quite easy for that to do damage to that intercooler, putting an end to your trip early. If you were going to consider putting a bull bar on this, with the intercooler being tucked in behind this bumper here, something you really want to consider is how much airflow that bull bar is going to allow to that intercooler.
Inside here, you've got your diesel filler and you've got this little blue one here, AdBlue on this Ford Ranger. This is something we're going to be seeing. It's a new form of emissions system that we're going to be seeing in Australia on pretty much every single ute in the next couple of years. It's already popular in Europe and the United States. What that's for, it's for what's called your SCR system, your Selective Catalyst Reduction System. Think of it like another thing like a DPF. It's basically to help with diesel emissions when you're driving. And it's another thing you have to fill up and maintain and keep on top of. Answer me this question, where have you seen an AdBlue pump at a servo, particularly out in remote Australia? Not very common, so it's another thing you're gonna have to keep on top of, keep it filled up and topped up. And we're gonna be seeing a lot more of this on utes in the future.
So with the diffs in the Rangers and the Amarok, they're what we call a banjo style diff, which means they have a cover plate over the back and the center is actually built inside the housing. Whereas these other utes have what we would call a pumpkin, and basically the entire differential will unbolt out of the front of the housing and you can just whack another one in and away you go. So you'll need specialist equipment and tooling and the right workshop to even be able to rebuild that diff. So if you're out in the bush, it really could cause you some trouble.
When it comes to being bushproof, I don't think the Nissan Navara is that cape worthy. You can see over here, the fuel filter is sort of modular, similar to the likes of the Nissan Patrol, and doesn't necessarily allow for easily interchangeable filters. This could become pretty costly if you are someone like myself who doesn't necessarily trust Australian fuel and is wanting to change your filter every 10,000 Ks. A reasonably common failure that we see on these NP300s are issues with turbos and DPF failures. One of the biggest contributing factors to that is the location of these breathers that control the two turbos. These breathers are extremely susceptible to sucking in dust and getting blocked up with mud, being right here at the front of the engine and having mud and dirt forced into it by the engine fan. Something else I would most definitely be upgrading if you bought the NP300 to go off-road would be the airbox and air intake system. You can see the air intake or the cold air intake down the front here is extremely restrictive and doesn't get a whole lot of airflow. You can improve this by upgrading your airbox and installing a snorkel so you have that nice air intake up the top without the restriction.
The thing I really enjoyed about the Nissan Navara would be the underbody. The engineers at Nissan really did consider the way that this vehicle drives an off-road tough terrain, rocky terrain. The underside chassis, everything's tucked up so well, better than any vehicle we had here testing at the Fall Drive Ute of the Year.
When it comes to being bushproof, the Isuzu D-Max would definitely be my pick of the bunch, especially if you're the type of person like me who's going to buy this car with the intention on keeping it for 10 years, spending your money and building it right the first time. Another few things that really makes this Isuzu D-Max bushproof is the easy location of the fuel filter up here. It takes a very short amount of time and it's quite cost effective to change that fuel filter with the Australian quality of fuel. Another really strong point about this Isuzu D-Max is quite easy, simple and basic intercooler hoses. The traditional style of intercooler hoses and clamps allows for a really easy upgrade when it comes to your front mount intercooler.
Another thing that is worth mentioning on these, the BT50 and another ute down there that we'll get to in a second, the tail shaft on them is made out of aluminium pipe and it's quite thick but with a thin wall. What I mean by that is the diameter is thick but the wall thickness of the pipe is thin, which means one hit and you're probably gonna corkscrew it or snap it in half. So be real careful if you're wheeling a D-Max a little bit harder. keep an eye on that rear tail shaft.
A few major concerns that we have with this model when it comes to being bushproof are things like this intercooler pipe here being made of plastic. If this was to become damaged at Cape York, the only option that you would have would be to replace this with this exact pipe to get you back on the road. I can only imagine if you're on a Cape York trip, this little ECU has become hot and would more than likely result with you coming back home on the back of a tow truck. The poor design of this airbox is also seen on other models of the Toyotas, such as the 300 series Land Cruiser and the Prado as well. If you don't address the airbox issue, it's very likely that you're going to have a turbo failure like this one here as a result. As you can see, the fins on the compressor wheel right here have already been damaged by dust. I think if things break, these are relatively easy. 1, to find parts, 2, to find people who can repair them, and 3, ultimately I think they've well and truly proven themselves to be reliable. The jury is still out whether or not these vehicles will be reliable, but from a mechanic standpoint, there's a few things that I like on this vehicle in comparison to a few of the others. For example, the turbo is mounted here up nice and high in the engine bay and will be quite easily changed if you ever did have a failure. This would more than likely be a lot more affordable to change in comparison to the NP300, where you have 2 turbos that are very time consuming to change.
A couple of things I noticed. For example, it's got a little bit low clearance. So if you did have one of these, you wanted to take it off-road, come over here and have a look. Doesn't have a lot of clearance under here if you're going to take it off-road. It does have some good underbody protection, and that tail shaft is mounted nice and high. So whilst it doesn't have the best ramp over angle and was getting a little bit stuck like a turtle on some of the tracks, with a moderate suspension lift in this, I reckon this would be an awesome weekender for doing a couple of tough tracks.
When it comes to the Mazda BT50, you can practically apply everything I said in regards to the Isuzu D-Max when it comes to its advantages and flaws.
The D-Max, BT50 and Hilux get top marks.
As far as the engines go on the bi-turbo 2-litre Ford Ranger, there's not a lot that can be done in the aftermarket performance-wise. They also haven't necessarily proven themselves to be the most reliable engine. This is not necessarily the car that I would be buying if I planned on keeping it for 10 years plus. One of the main reasons that these are not the most reliable vehicle is this little 2-litre bi-turbo is extremely highly strung and essentially has to be to compete with the likes of the V6 Ranger that has a far bigger displacement. From the testing that we've done on the dyno with these vehicles, we've found that they are extremely high boost mixed with a heck of a lot of fuel, which leads to really rich AFRs, really high EGTs, and it's not necessarily the setup that you'd want to be using if you are towing heavy very constantly. Generally speaking, from a tuning perspective, the fact that these are so highly strung and the AFRs are quite rich generally means that we're not likely to be able to get those really good gains that you might see from the likes of the Hilux and the D-Max. So the V6 Amarok, the Ford Ranger 3-litre V6 and this Ford Ranger 2-litre all share the same 10-speed transmission. Unfortunately, this 10-speed transmission comes out from the factory with a poor little heat exchanger on the side as well as a plastic pan. One of the most common things that we do in the shop is to install a larger aluminium automatic transmission pan. That's to improve cooling. As well as that, we'll install an aftermarket auto transmission cooler up the front to allow for better airflow through that auto transmission cooler. When it comes to performance with the NP300, they have a huge amount of potential, meaning with the likes of an ECU remap, you can improve the performance on these by over 30% in power and torque. One of the main reasons we are able to increase power and torque so significantly on this model is the modern turbocharger system, which is essentially 2 turbos, one small and one large. The small one works down low to give you nice, smooth and fast torque. Once that small turbo runs out of puff, the larger one takes over and allows you to keep that consistent power throughout the rev range. Another common problem known on these NP300s is the failure of the rear main seal. Although Nissan has been taking the charge in repairing these issues, they haven't necessarily taken any significant steps to reduce the failures. From a performance standpoint, the Ford JJ3 has huge potential when it comes to increasing power and torque, and that comes from being able to increase the boost pressure significantly over what comes from standard. They also have quite large injectors, which gives us the opportunity to deliver the fuel and match it with that turbo. Not too dissimilar to other makes and models, one of the things that I would most definitely be upgrading if you were to buy this Isuzu D-Max would be the air intake. I personally would go with the likes of a stainless steel airbox, as this one here has to be heavily modified to adapt to a plastic snorkel. Similarly to the Ford Ranger, these Isuzu D-Max have a heat exchanger mounted down next to the transmission, and cooling of that transmission could be increased significantly by installing a front-mounted auto trans cooler. The Isuzu D-Max has great airflow through the grille, which will allow you to upgrade that intercooler and also allow you room to install that front-mount auto trans cooler. When it comes to reliability, one of the biggest improvements that they made in the Ford JJ3 over the previous Ford JJ1 was the turbo right here. This IHI turbo right here is electronically controlled, and comes from factory with around 19 PSI. Our personal D-Max has been running around 30 PSI very comfortably for over 100,000 Ks. As far as UTE of the year goes, the VW Amarok is by far my pick of the bunch off the showroom floor. It definitely is a standout on paper. However, it's not necessarily the kind of car that I would buy personally to own for the next 10 years and put up to 500,000 Ks on. As is to be expected when you introduce a new product to the market, the 3-litre V6 has seen some failures, however, hasn't been necessarily around long enough for Ford to have taken action to prevent those failures in future. In 2 to 3 years' time, we will definitely know exactly how reliable this engine can be. The power delivery of this V6 is quite impressive, and it's a good thing too because they are extremely limited in the aftermarket as far as performance upgrades go. What you can expect to see is the use of piggyback ECUs to be increasing the power and torque of these in the aftermarket. Practically everything that I've raised for this VW Amarok also carries over to the V6 Ford Ranger. Although the Toyota Hilux may be behind in technology in comparison to the likes of the VW and the Ford Ranger, it would still be one of the top picks for me as a person who's going to build this car and keep it for a long period of time. We can generally increase power and torque by up to 30% on these vehicles without having to necessarily do any physical modifications. However, one of the biggest advantages of the 1GD when it comes to power is the fact that we can tune the automatic transmission as well as making physical valve body upgrades to support bigger power in the future. Similarly to other makes and models, we would definitely recommend the installation of an auto transcooler. I would say for those of you at home, probably made your mind up before you've even seen this vehicle, just the same way I did. But I can tell you now that there's a few strong points on this car that well and truly outperform the rest. For example, this car comes with silicon intercooler pipes. It's also the only vehicle that we have here today that has a front mount automatic transmission cooler already installed. Other things worth mentioning, the injectors are quite easily accessible on top of the engine here, which could result in less labour expenses if you ever had to change them in the future. While this may not necessarily be the kind of car for me, I can definitely see how this has a place in the market, especially those who are a little bit more budget conscious or not necessarily car enthusiasts. When it comes to the Mazda BT50, you can practically apply everything I said in regards to the Isuzu D-Max when it comes to its advantages and flaws.
Just it has that good, honest turbo diesel feel, pushing through some of the softer sand, pushing, making sure stability control's off. I mean, 4 high and using manual selective gears, you could feel it push and drive and the power's there. It's like there's a little bit of lag in the throttle, but not too much for a modern vehicle. It's a lot of fun to drive.
The 2-litre Ranger might be a good commuting rig and go well on the beach, but the engine is highly strung and the transmission is gonna need some work done to it if you're gonna be towing or using this thing in anger. We don't want to dock points off the Ranger having AdBlue because it might be the first of many that'll go down this path. But it's got to be a very big consideration in your purchasing decision. We recommend getting in before all utes go this way. The Navara makes fantastic power and torque. The inherent rear main seal issue needs to be addressed and something all NAV owners need to factor into their servicing costs. The BT50 and D-Max are absolute workhorses. They're reliable, make awesome power and have an excellent track record. They get high marks in this category. The Auto still needs some work, so it scores an 8. The Amarok and Ranger V6 is a weapon of an engine. In terms of power and drivability, it wins hands down. If we had 5 to 6 years more wear and tear on these engines to see how they will really last, we could make a better judgment call on reliability. Let's get a few more in the country with 200,000 plus Ks on them before we make this call. Toyota has done a fantastic job at fixing the failures their Hilux engine has had. So they're in a top pick in terms of reliability and power. But do yourself a favour and factor in an airbox and snorkel replacement as part of the purchasing price. The Cannon is still a relatively new engine, and while it doesn't have the rep the others have, we found it very drivable, and that auto cooler on the front, it gets a big thumbs up in our box. Brakes are always such an overlooked part of a dual cab, but it's one element where we see such a difference in setups. This year, we've got Ian from Bendix Brakes here, who's brought along a proper brake testing machine that'll measure stopping distance from 100 k's an hour. Let's see how they fared and then why. We've staggered out the utes based on their stopping distance so you can see the difference.
Braking test, 100 kilometres an hour, emergency stop, obviously to a stop, and we're recording this in metres. So this device has GPS and plugs into ABD. So 100 kilometre an hour to 0. Ford Ranger, 42 metres. Amarok, 44 metres, very impressive. Not far behind, Hilux, 45 metres. Absolute triple header on the nose, 54 metres for the BT, the D-Max and the Cannon. And then we come to the nav. So from our 100 km/h to a stop, 64 metres. You see the Wildtrak behind us and the Amarok and the Hilux for that matter, absolutely beautiful. That's world class, that's what you want, that's good safety. So these three vehicles, that's quite good. The issue you're going to have is when you start to really load them up, that braking performance is going to fall away. The Nissan, unfortunately, again, as we said earlier, if you really got your heart set on the Navara, you're probably going to do a brake upgrade for this vehicle. At 64 metres to stop, the reality is, as this car would have been going past the D-Max, we would have been doing 30 kilometres an hour still. So everything else has stopped, we're still motoring down the road. So brake systems, effectively what we're doing is we're converting our kinetic energy, movement, into heat. So the more heat you can get out of the system, the more effective your braking will be. So there's a few things that you can do. In this design, lots of friction, big pad, gets rid of the heat very effectively. Again, good reliable braking system, and it was proven out in our data that we did in our testing. So on the Ranger and the Amarok, again, we've got this combined booster down in here, the master cylinder, the ABS pump, and the electronics that control all that is in one unit. From what we can see, it's a single unit, so if any one part of that was to fail, then you're probably up for the whole lot. You know, we don't know, but we're guessing it's not going to be cheap. So every other ute on this test has a more conventional hydraulic system for the brakes. So in this case, that's our conventional master cylinder, our brake booster here, and our ABS pump. So if you would have a problem with any one of these items, they can be replaced separately, and every mechanic in the country is going to be familiar with how they work and how to replace them. The brake setup on the Navara comes from a time when these utes were smaller and lighter. You can see we've got a 300mm diameter rotor. The Ranger, for instance, and the Amarok were at 340mm, so it's significantly smaller. We found in our testing this vehicle took 64 metres to stop. The Ranger, we managed to get that down to 42 metres, so that's a significant stopping difference, you know, from 100 km/h. So lots of good things about the Navara. If you've got your heart set on one, you probably want to think about a brake upgrade. 4 of the 7 utes we've tested this week are a disc brake rear setup now, so fantastic. It makes a really big difference. Unfortunately with the Toyota, it's only available on the Rogue and the new GR Sport, but it makes a massive difference. So particularly if you're carrying a big load, disc brakes on the rear, 100% improvement, significant stopping distance improvements that we've seen. So drum brake systems have been on utes forever. We're seeing more of a move to a disc system. Drum brakes are reasonably effective if your speeds aren't that high, if your loads aren't that great. Biggest issue with drums is they don't get the heat out very well, so a disc is significantly more effective at getting the heat out of the braking system. But a lot of the utes were using drums because essentially they were fairly cheap and they gave you a reasonably effective park brake. The one thing that we are seeing on some of these utes now, like the Ranger and the Amarok, and dare I say the Cannon, is an electric park brake. So electric park brake as well is really, really effective when it comes to holding the vehicle on a steep incline.
The Amarok, Wildtrak and Hilux win this one, with all having a similar stopping distance of 40 to 45 metres. The D-Max, BT50 and Cannon had the same distance of 54 metres, and with little to no surprise, the Navara scoring of 6. The size of those discs really do make a difference in comparison to the Wildtrak X.
So let's start with the newest vehicle in the whole fleet here, the VW Amarok. Based off the Ford Ranger platform, it's a perfect vehicle with the new chassis and suspension setup. Makes it a lot easier to put a train canopy on it. So the old variant in the Amarok range made it very difficult for manufacturers. There wasn't a simple plug and play process for all your wiring and your chassis mounts. The new platform in the Amarok, being based off the Ford Ranger, keeps it the same in all of the variants, making it a lot easier for all manufacturers to be able to set this one up for a train canopy, which is perfect. So moving over to the Navara and the Wildtrak X. These both come out with upgraded suspension from factory, but one thing to consider is, are they set up for low carrying capacities? These springs are set up more for comfort. So one thing to consider is when you're putting a train canopy on is your spring rates. You really need to think about the low carrying capacity on each of these vehicles. For both of these vehicles, I'd be looking at a constant spring rate of at least 300 to 500 kilos. And then if you're going to be loading it up and touring a lot, I'd be looking at some sort of GWM upgrade.
In previous years, we've seen a big difference when it comes to which ute can have what size canopy on the back. This year it's really even, and with pretty much all utes having tech like lane detection and the likes, we're going to score all utes a pass mark here. How lucky we are to have such an excellent range of utes that we can comfortably modify and put the setup on the back that we're really wanting.
When it comes to comfort, you want a vehicle that makes it easy to drive, say, from Brisbane to Sydney with no issues. It comes down to the user interface, the infotainment system, and more importantly, the seats.
Both the BT50 and the D-Max interiors are functional. And that's about all. I must say I find both quite well laid out ergonomically. You can definitely reach all of the buttons really easily and at a glance find the thing that you're looking for. It's really well labeled and marked and very obvious what its purpose is. That is a big plus for this vehicle.
The BT50 seats just feel outdated and I feel like I'm sitting on the ground. It just feels cheap. I mean, this is the most expensive car in the convoy. One big thing that I'm not a fan of in any car though is a button for volume. It does need a dial. Off-road and things like that, when you want to turn the volume up and down, buttons are a no-no.
One of the most outstanding features of this Amarok in comparison to the other vehicles that we have here today is the 12-inch infotainment system. This is absolutely incredible technology and good to see the direction that the utes will be heading into the very near future.
I'll tell you what, I'm a real fan of the amount of information being given to us on this display. I mean, all the data's already in the ECUs of all these vehicles. These guys have put it right where we need it, usable, functional, right in front of us.
In typical fashion of these European style vehicles, it is really well finished, down to the seats, the interior, the steering wheel, the dash. It all just looks really, really nice.
I was time to jump in the Ford Ranger. First impressions, well, it's bloody nice. Really well appointed, very good. Diff locks on the screen. Probably would have liked to have seen a button for the diff lock.
I do like the Wildtraks. The fit and finish in one of these cars is far more superior than the rest of the convoy.
So just jumped into the Cannon and this is the first time I've seen it and seen the interior, and actually it's quite surprising. The infotainment system looks really good. It's quite an impressive place to be actually.
Righto, so while the Cannon's got all the tech, I've got to say the lane keeping feels like my dad's Ferguson tractor, which is lumpy and steers us all over the place.
My only big criticism of that is they're just trying to put too much in it. You know, you're sacrificing quality over tech. Get the basics right. Toyota, look at them. Like, their screen's so pixelated.
Yeah.
But mechanically, that thing's going to last forever.
Yeah, that's right.
First thing I noticed when I jumped in this car is how familiar everything feels. Everything you need is at fingertips. You're not looking for anything. Nothing is super out there where you don't know how to turn the aircon on or how to put it into full drive. Everything is just very familiar. Is probably the best word to describe it.
It definitely doesn't compare very well to the likes of the VW, but for someone like myself who doesn't necessarily need, you know, a million gadgets, this is basically perfect for me.
The one thing I do notice about this as well is they've thrown in the extra JBL speakers up there, which kind of just looks like an afterthought in my opinion.
One thing I'm not a huge fan of on this model is the headlights. Kind of reminds me of bug eyes a little bit. Not a huge fan of those. Not real sleek.
After driving the other vehicles today, the Nissan Navara just does not feel like anything special. I'm really not a big fan of the interior. It's very basic, very plastic.
Nothing particularly flash or fancy or nice, given that this is the up-spec model as well. Just a lot of big, flat plastic surfaces that are very uninspiring.
All the utes in the lineup have done well with keeping up with the times with an interior and infotainment system. But in particular, the new Amarok and Ford Ranger are leaps and bounds ahead with what you get inside the cab. That makes sense though, they are from the new edition of utes, so it'll be interesting to see what the next generation of the other models bring to the table in terms of user interface and comfort in the cab. What do you prefer? Are you one for a completely touchscreen display, or do you prefer the old school method of dials and knobs? Righto, after all the testing, here's the final numbers on where the utes are scoring. But there's one huge factor that we haven't considered yet: pricing and value for money. Of course, someone could build a better, more comfy, more powerful ute, but at what cost increase to the end user? And just because it's expensive doesn't mean it's good. And just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's good value for money.
Let's take a look at what these utes cost in the form we tested, plus at a mid-range and entry-level spec. These prices are all for dual cab auto transmission 4-wheel drive versions. Something you see across the board is the cost of the top spec versions the manufacturers gave us to test. A few years ago, the top spec variants of each ute were pretty much giving you slightly better, fancier trims and maybe a nicer steering wheel and stereo. These models presented, in our opinion, pretty poor value for money. You could instead buy an entry-level or mid-spec version of the same ute and add all the gear you need as a 4-wheel driver or tradie for the price of the top spec one. This year it's different. The Wildtrak X and Navara Pro 4X Warrior come with a heap of extras you'd need to upgrade yourself with aftermarket gear like suspension, bar work and all-terrain tyres. That said, the Thunder version of the BT50 doesn't present great value for money, and the other top spec versions offer better value for money. We still really recommend mid and entry level spec and spend your money on aftermarket gear that can be more custom set up to how you use the vehicle. Looking at the pricing, you can even see that the top spec Cannon is a whopping $52,490. It's cheaper than the second cheapest entry-level vehicle. That offers incredible value, and after you've seen it get tested in this video, you know you're getting a whole lot of ute for that price. Imagine all the gear you could add to it before you're out of pocket the same as a V6 Amarok or a Hilux. Well, there can only be one winner. And we reckon this year it was the hardest of all to choose because we're lucky enough to have such an excellent range of utes that are all perfect for certain owners. But we've come to a conclusion. If you're going to keep the ute stock and use it within its capabilities straight off the showroom floor, the winner has to be the V6 Amarok or the Ford Ranger equivalent. They're big, comfortable, powerful, easy to drive, smooth and beautifully made. It would also be the clear choice as a tow vehicle. That engine is unmatched when it comes to towing vans, boats, bike trailers or horse floats. But it's not the winner if you're the person wanting to build up a proper touring rig that you're planning on taking to remote parts of Australia and owning for 400 to 500,000 Ks. Why? Firstly, the engine is still untested. Let's judge it on that in a couple of years once they've been out and driven around the country more. Secondly, the price. For a lot of us, putting all that money into a vehicle and then throwing another 15 to 20 grand towards aftermarket gear on it is a tall order. That's almost a $100,000 investment easily.
If you're wanting to build a tourer, our winners are the Hilux, D-Max and BT50.
Sure, you're buying a ute that isn't as refined as the Ranger and Amarok, but you are buying a proven, reliable engine and transmission where all the issues have been found and resolved on it already. Throw that money into the canopy or suspension and 12 volt and you have a better value for money setup. We have to give a massive, highly commended to the GWM Cannon. It truly surprised and impressed the heck out of us, and for the price you can step into one, I bet plenty of you watching are having thoughts about going to test drive one. There's also way more aftermarket gear for them than you might think. Go check one out, they would be a good buy. And finally, another big shout out to Ford. The Wildtrak X is changing the way manufacturers are thinking about their customer, us. All the 4-wheel drive specific additions they've made to this model show they really care about us, and it's a perfect option for a straight out of the box 4-wheel drive. We only wish this model came in the V6 and didn't need AdBlue.
And I can't believe that I'm actually going to say this, but if it was my hard-earned money on one of these utes, if I was going to buy one brand new, it would be this one. I know what you're thinking, Jocko, are you serious? How about you go up a little and choose a different ute? But the fact that this is a reliable, proven platform, if I wanted to buy a vehicle that's going to last for years, do 500,000 Ks of hard off-road work, it will be the Hilux, followed extremely closely by the D-Max. Now, I pose a question to you guys. Your hard-earned money, what I'd like you to do now is go stand by the ute you would buy if you were buying one. Let's go.
And that's the results for 2023's Ute of the Year. This truly was a hard test to boil down. What would you choose? Let us know in the comments below. Are we on the money with choosing something like an Amarok as a perfect daily driver and tow rig? Or would you rather go with a proven, reliable setup like a D-Max or Hilux? Or is value for money your main thing, like the Cannon? Let us know in the comments below.
That's a wrap from us. We'll see you in the next video on 4-Wheel Drive 24/7.